wealthy and powerful CEO stumbles upon his secretary in the most unexpected place, the men's bathroom, where she has mistakenly entered and, against all odds, falls hopelessly in love. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Now, sit back and enjoy. Juliette Cole was having, without a doubt, one of the most disastrous mornings of her life. She hurried through the pristine hallways of Smith Enterprises, frantically searching for the meeting room where she was expected in just 5 minutes. It was her first day as an interpreter, and naturally, she was already running late. Whew! Fantastic, Juliette. You're about to get fired before even signing your contract. Truly record-breaking, she muttered under her breath, gripping her bag and tablet as if they could somehow save her. But just as she thought things couldn't get worse, a far more urgent problem arose. A shiver ran down her spine. That was when she noticed something was off. Where were the makeup mirrors? The feminine hygiene bins? And the boss. Have you ever seen fury in its purest form? Juliette's blood ran cold. What? Male voices? She blinked. Once, twice, 3 times. Then, slowly, her gaze swept the room. No. No, no, no. Her breath caught in her throat, her mind blanked, her stomach clenched with horror. She had walked into the men's bathroom. Panic seized her. Acting purely on instinct, she spun around and did the only logical thing she could think of. She dove into the nearest stall and shut the door behind her. Okay, stay calm, Juliette. They'll leave soon and you'll just slip out unnoticed. No harm, no foul. It was a flawless plan, except for one minor detail. She had forgotten to lock the door. And that was when fate chose to play its cruelest trick on her. The handle turned, the stall door swung open, and standing before her was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his only attire a loosely wrapped towel. Juliette's gaze locked onto the stranger's lay. Leonardo Smith practically jumped backward, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief, as if he had just stumbled upon a ghost. What the? Juliette, already frozen in place, let out a scream of her own. Why are you screaming? She shrieked, instinctively grabbing the nearest object, a toilet paper roll, as if it were a life-saving weapon. Why are you here? Leonardo shot back, eyes darting around as if searching for hidden cameras, trying to determine whether this was some kind of absurd prank or just a stress-induced hallucination. Juliette's panicked mind could only produce 3 words. I am dead. Her eyes, acting on their own accord, flickered down to his sculpted abs, before she realized what she was doing and snapped her head away so fast she nearly gave herself whiplash. I'm sorry, I didn't see anything. I swear I didn't see anything, she babbled, throwing her hands over her eyes as if that could erase the last few seconds. Yes, you did, Leonardo shot back, gripping his towel as if his very dignity depended on it. In full-blown panic mode, Juliette took a frantic step backward, only for her foot to catch on the edge of the stall's mat. With a mortifying yelp, she lost her balance and crashed onto the cold, unforgiving floor. Out. Leonardo squeezed his eyes shut for a brief moment, inhaling deeply, as if summoning every ounce of patience he had left. Tell me this is a nightmare, and that I'm going to wake up any second now. Juliette, now teetering on the edge of a complete meltdown, scrambled to gather her thoughts. I was... She flailed a hand toward the toilet, grasping for any remotely plausible excuse. In the men's bathroom, Leonardo folded his arms, his sharp gaze pinning her in place. Juliette felt sheer panic course through her veins like wildfire. I'm from the sanitary safety audit, she blurted out. Yes. Yes, it's a brand new program, very innovative. We're the first company to test it. Juliette rattled off at breakneck speed. Then, seizing the opportunity, she pointed toward the door. And now I really need to leave. Juliette attempted to slip past him, but Leonardo swiftly blocked her path, his towering frame making escape impossible. With an exasperated sigh, he pinched the bridge of his nose, looking every bit like a man questioning all his life choices. Is this some kind of a hidden camera prank? His sharp eyes darted around the restroom, scanning for any suspicious recording devices. Juliette's heart nearly stopped. What? No, of course not. I just walked into the wrong place, she blurted out, her voice an octave higher than usual. Leonardo inhaled deeply, his patience hanging by a thread. Fantastic, now get out! Flustered beyond belief, Juliette scrambled to her feet, only to miscalculate her movement and slam her head against the stall wall. Ouch! Leonardo dragged a hand down his face, visibly restraining himself from losing it completely. Are you actively trying to self-destruct in front of me? Not on purpose, she shot back defensively, rubbing her head. Then move before someone walks in and assumes the CEO of Smith Enterprises is holding an employee hostage in the men's restroom. The mere thought sent a jolt of panic through Juliette's body. She launched herself toward the exit, moving so fast she tripped over the janitor's cart. A second later, crash! A bucket of water went flying, spilling all over the pristine floor. Leonardo barely managed to jump out of the way before disaster struck. For a long moment, Juliette stared at the mess, then at Leonardo, then back at the mess. This is it, hired and fired on the same day. Leonardo's eye twitched. Get out, he practically roared. Yes, sir. And with that, she bolted out of the bathroom, her face burning hotter than the sun. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. By the time Leonardo had composed himself, dressed, and made his way to the meeting, there she was. Sitting among the other executives, Juliette attempted an awkward, visibly nervous smile. Leonardo froze mid-step. No way, his eyes narrowed dangerously. What are you doing here? Juliette swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. Well, Mr. Smith, I'm your new interpreter? Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. You could hear a pin drop. Leonardo closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, as if summoning the last ounce of patience in his soul. I am definitely being punished for something I did in a past life. He was still struggling to process the absurdity of it all. The woman he had just found hiding in a stall in the men's restroom. The same woman who had nearly scared him to death. Who had turned the floor into a miniature flood zone with a single catastrophic misstep. Was his new interpreter? This had to be some kind of cosmic joke. The meeting room remained utterly silent. Every executive in the room was now watching the bizarre exchange unfold, their gazes flicking between him and Juliette Cole, who was currently attempting to disappear behind a stack of papers. She was visibly sweating. Leonardo's stare sharpened. You? He finally spoke, breaking the unbearable silence. You're my interpreter? Juliette, already bracing herself for the inevitable firing, forced the most professional smile she could muster. Technically, yes? Leonardo arched a brow, arms crossing over his chest. Technically? She cleared her throat, shifting into full corporate mode, her voice steadying. I mean, yes. I was hired to assist with international meetings and ensure seamless communication between the company and foreign investors. Leonardo blinked. Slowly, as if his brain needed extra time to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. And you started your first day by barging into the men's restroom. Juliette squeezed her eyes shut for a split second, fighting the overwhelming urge to vanish into thin air. It was a minor navigation error. Leonardo's lips pressed into a thin line. Navigation error? Yes, I got lost, got confused, went through the wrong door, and suddenly, poof, I was there, in the stall. With you. By accident, of course. Juliette let out a nervous laugh, but it did little to ease the unbearable tension in the room. Silence. Then one of the executives cleared his throat and attempted to lighten the mood. Well, at least we know Miss Cole has an adventurous spirit. A few quiet chuckles followed, but Leonardo was far from amused. Running a hand down his face, he exhaled slowly, as if questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. Do I really deserve this? Is the universe punishing me for something? He muttered under his breath. His gaze landed on Juliette, who was now furiously shuffling papers, pretending to be deeply engrossed in her work. Now I have to work with her. Resigned to his fate, he pulled out his chair, sat down, and tapped his fingers against the table. All right, since everyone's here, let's begin. Juliette let out a quiet, relieved sigh. Finally. It seemed like he was going to move on and leave her alone. But then, Miss Cole? She froze. Translate what I just said. Now, her breath hitched. Leonardo raised an unimpressed eyebrow. He tilted his head slightly, his tone laced with challenge. I said, I want you to translate. Now. Juliette swallowed hard. Oh, so he was going to test her. Right here, right now. Okay, Juliette, deep breath. You studied for this. You can do it. Steeling herself, she turned to the foreign investors and flawlessly translated Leonardo's words. The executives nodded in approval, murmuring among themselves. But Leonardo? He didn't look convinced. His gaze remained locked on her, calculating. "Good," he said, his expression unreadable. "Then? And this. Translate this. Now, this one and this." With each phrase Leonardo threw at her, Juliette fired back with flawless translations, her confidence unwavering. She was quick, precise, and effortlessly adapted to the nuances of the language. The executives were visibly impressed. By the end of the meeting, murmurs of approval filled the room. Everyone was satisfied, everyone except Leonardo. His sharp gaze remained locked on her, still searching for a reason, any reason, to get rid of her. As soon as the investors exited, he wasted no time. "1 week, huh?" Juliette blinked, caught off guard. "You have exactly 1 week to prove you deserve this job," he said, rising to his feet and buttoning his jacket. "One mistake, and you're out." Juliette crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. 1 week, exactly. Leonardo smirked, eyes glinting with challenge. "If you survive," Juliette narrowed her eyes. "So it's a test. Call it whatever you want." He shrugged, completely unfazed. "But don't get too comfortable." With one last pointed look, he turned and strode out of the room, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. As soon as the door clicked shut, Juliette collapsed into her chair, exhaling a long, exhausted sigh. 1 week? Seriously? But if Leonardo Smith thought she would back down that easily, he had another thing coming. The challenge begins. Over the next few days, Leonardo pulled out every trick in the book. He buried her in complex translations, demanded impossibly detailed. She did it all with a smile. No matter how demanding the task, no matter how impossible the deadline, Juliette never lost her sense of humor. One morning, for instance, Leonardo appeared at her desk without warning and dropped a massive report in front of her. "I need this translated in 2 hours." Juliette glanced at the towering stack of pages. Then she looked at him. 2 hours? Is there a problem? She flashed him an innocent smile. No, I was just trying to determine whether you have any real concept of time or if you exist in some kind of parallel dimension." Leonardo arched an eyebrow. "I heard that. You were supposed to, Mr. Smith." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Good. Now stop talking and start translating." Juliette sighed but got to work, and, to Leonardo's increasing frustration, she finished on time. The breaking point? But not every moment was a victory. By the 4th day, exhaustion hit her like a freight train. She had barely slept, spent the entire day translating dense contracts, and was running on fumes. So when Leonardo asked her a question, she answered in German. Without even realizing it, he blinked. "What?" Juliette stared at him, her brain sluggishly catching up. "Did I forget to switch to English?" "Yes, oh." Silence. "Well, you should learn German. It's a beautiful language," she said breezily, not even bothering to explain herself. Leonardo dragged a hand down his face, exhaling slowly. "This woman is going to drive me insane." The final verdict. By the end of the week, when Juliette walked into Leonardo's office for his final verdict, he was standing by the window, hands buried in his pockets. "Sit down," he said without turning around. Juliette obeyed, bracing herself for whatever was coming. Finally, he turned to face her. "You passed the test." She nearly choked on her own breath. "What?" Leonardo sighed, as if the words physically pained. "Historic." His gaze sharpened. "Just don't get yourself into any more trouble." Juliette stood, gathering her things. "I promise I won't walk into any more men's restrooms." "Good." But as she walked out, a small, reluctant smile flickered across Leonardo's lips. He wasn't ready to admit it, but something about her intrigued him. And that irritated him to no end. A battlefield at work. Juliette was slowly getting used to her work routine. Well, almost. Because working with Leonardo Smith felt like being on a battlefield. The man had a special talent for making her life difficult. He was demanding, a perfectionist, and always found ways to test her limits. If she translated a document in record time, he handed her an even more complex one. If she organized every contract meticulously, he created new, arbitrary requirements just to watch her scramble. Is this war, Smith? Because I'm ready to fight, Juliette muttered under her breath while carrying a precarious stack of files. Unfortunately, that was the exact moment Leonardo happened to walk by. He raised an eyebrow. What did you just say? Juliette froze. Nothing. I was just talking to no one. He gave her an unimpressed once-over, rolled his eyes, and walked back to his office. Juliette exhaled sharply. Okay, I just need to survive another day. That can't be too hard, right? Another impossible task. She was deep in concentration, translating a massive report, when a document landed directly in front of her face. She blinked and looked up. Leonardo, I need this translated. She glanced at the thick file. How much time do I have? He crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly. Now. Juliette blinked. Now? Is there a problem? She inhaled sharply, squared her shoulders, and grabbed the document. Challenge accepted. The deadline dilemma. No problem. I was just wondering if you happen to follow a religion that forbids giving people reasonable deadlines. Leonardo's eyebrow arched. What was that? Nothing, I'm on it. Before he could say another word, Juliette grabbed the file and disappeared into the conference room, locking herself inside, as if her life depended on it. Leonardo knew he was pushing her hard. He wanted to see her crack under pressure, but Juliette wasn't going to break that easily. 2 hours later, she walked into his office, holding the translated document with a confident smile. Here you go, Mr. Smith. Proofread and everything. Leonardo took the file and skimmed through it, his expression unreadable. Juliette held her breath, and then, It's acceptable. She raised an eyebrow. Acceptable? Yes. Acceptable. Acceptable in Leonardo Smith's dictionary means perfect, brilliant, and better than expected, right? He snapped the folder shut, ignoring her teasing. Juliette smirked. She was winning these little battles, but she knew Leonardo wasn't going to make it easy. The big test. That afternoon, Leonardo had a high-stakes meeting with a group of foreign investors. Juliette sat beside him, prepared to translate. The room was filled with executives in sharp suits, all watching Leonardo as if he were a king about to make a decree that would shape their futures. Juliette maintained her composure, translating every word with precision. And then, one of the investors made a critical mistake. Instead of stating an investment amount of 200 million, he said 20 million. Juliette's brain processed it immediately. She glanced at Leonardo, waiting for him to correct it. But he didn't. He just sat there, impassive. It was a test. Juliette swallowed hard. If I correct him, I risk overstepping my position. But if I don't, this deal could go south. She made her choice. With a steady voice, she corrected the number without hesitation. The investor hesitated, then realized his mistake and nodded in understanding. Leonardo showed no reaction. The meeting continued, but once the investors left, he finally turned to her. You caught that mistake quickly. Juliette stiffened. Yes. And you had the courage to correct it. Yes. A pause. Then, good job. Juliette blinked. Sorry, could you repeat that? Leonardo raised an eyebrow. What? Did you just compliment me? Because I could have sworn I heard something like that. Leonardo rolled his eyes and turned away. Juliette grinned. A win was a win. Don't get used to it. Juliette smiled. And in that moment, for the first time, Leonardo Smith realized he was starting to enjoy her presence. Understanding Leonardo Smith. Juliette was beginning to figure him out. Leonardo Smith was a blend of military discipline, extreme perfectionism, and a touch of emotional detachment. But beneath that impenetrable exterior, there was something else, something she couldn't quite define, a mystery. And the more time she spent around him, the more she felt it. The past few days had been relentless, but she refused to back down. No matter how much he tested her, no matter how many times he rolled his eyes at her comments, or tried, unsuccessfully, to push her away, she had already won one of the toughest battles. A compliment from Leonardo Smith. Reluctant but real, still, there was something about him that intrigued her. She'd worked for difficult bosses before. Perfectionists, control freaks, the kind who made impossible demands. But none of them carried the weight he did. And that night, at the company's gala event, she finally got a clue as to why. The gala. The event was grand, luxurious halls, elegantly dressed guests, waiters moving smoothly between them balancing trays of champagne glasses. Juliette had been instructed to attend, not to enjoy herself, of course, but to assist Leonardo in case any foreign business partners required translation. She expected him to be there early, perfectly punctual as always, but he arrived late, and the moment he walked in, Juliette knew something was off. He looked pale, more serious than usual, if that was even possible. His sharp eyes scanned the room, searching for something, or someone. Then, just as a waiter passed by offering a glass of champagne, Leonardo abruptly stopped. Juliette watched as he recoiled from the gesture, stepping back as if the glass contained poison instead of sparkling wine. "Strons, Leonardo!" she called, taking a step toward him. He didn't respond. Instead, he walked straight to the balcony, away from the noise and glittering lights. Juliette hesitated. She could leave him alone, let him work through whatever this was in peace. Or she could follow her instincts. She chose the latter. A glimpse of the past. When she stepped outside, she found him standing at the edge of the balcony, hands gripping the railing. His posture was stiff, his jaw tight. He wasn't just serious, he was tense. She approached cautiously. "You okay?" "It's none of your business," he said, his voice low. Juliette crossed her arms, leaning against the railing beside him. "You don't look okay." He exhaled sharply but didn't answer. "I just need a minute," he muttered. She watched him, waiting. Silence stretched between them. And then, as if making some internal decision, he finally spoke. "I hate champagne." Juliette frowned. That was unexpected. "You hate champagne?" "Yes." "Any particular reason?" At last he turned to her, and for the first time since they'd met, Juliette saw something she never expected. Vulnerability. "Yes," he said simply. But he didn't explain further. Juliette could have let it go. She could have pretended this conversation never happened, turned around and walked back into the glittering ballroom. But something told her this moment mattered. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked softly. Leonardo let out a humorless laugh. "Do I look like someone who talks about feelings? Honestly? No. But I think it's time someone tried." His gaze snapped to her, surprised. For a moment, Juliette thought he'd brush her off with a sarcastic remark, that he'd smirk, roll his eyes, and walk away like he always did. But he didn't. Instead, he turned back to the city skyline, gripping the railing tighter. "A long time ago," he said, voice lower now, "I used to like champagne." Juliette stayed quiet, sensing this was the kind of moment that could vanish if she pushed too hard. He exhaled slowly. "Until one day, I realized it was always there during the worst moments of my life." A chill ran down her spine. "The day I lost someone I loved, there was a glass of champagne in my hand. The day my life turned upside down, I was at an event just like this, surrounded by people drinking, toasting, laughing while my world fell apart." Juliette's breath hitched. He never talked about his personal life. It was as if the years before he became one of the most powerful men in the country had been a past erased. "You lost someone important," she said gently. Leonardo turned his head slightly, his usual sharp, calculating gaze replaced by something else, something distant, something broken. "Yes." Juliette felt her chest tighten. He looked away, jaw clenched. "But it doesn't matter. The past is the past." Juliette studied him for a moment. "It does matter," she said finally. His head snapped toward her, brows furrowing. "What? What happened to you?" "Leonardo, it matters." His lips pressed into a thin line. Then he shut his eyes for a brief second, like he was trying to block out her words. "I don't talk about it." "I noticed." A short, bitter laugh escaped him. Juliette hesitated, then smiled softly. "But if you ever want to, I know how to listen." She didn't know why she said it, maybe because she had a feeling no one ever had. For a long moment he just looked at her, like he was trying to figure her out, like he wasn't used to someone offering something without expecting anything in return. Finally, he sighed and turned away. "Let's go back to the party," Juliette nodded. He started walking, but just before stepping back into the ballroom, he paused, glanced over his shoulder. "Thank you." It was almost inaudible, but Juliette heard it. and for some reason it felt more important than any deal he had ever closed. And for the first time, she knew she had broken through a wall no one else had, and maybe, just maybe, that was a problem. The distance between them. Juliette tried to shake off the strange feeling lingering after her conversation with Leonardo on the balcony. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But the truth was, something about him intrigued her more than it should. He was rude, controlling, and sometimes downright unbearable. But at the same time, there were moments, fleeting but real, when his cold exterior cracked, revealing a man who carried a weight too heavy for one person, and that was dangerous. Because she wasn't supposed to care, in the days that followed, Leonardo seemed even more reserved than usual. He barely looked at her during meetings, kept their conversations strictly professional, avoided any hint of familiarity, as if willing that moment of vulnerability into non-existence. He was rebuilding his walls, but the thing about walls, they never lasted forever. The business trip. The upcoming business trip gave him the perfect excuse to put more distance between them. Unfortunately for him, Juliette had to go too. As Leonardo's personal interpreter, she was required to attend the international conference, ensuring seamless communication between high-profile investors. Juliette wasn't worried about her job. She was good at it. But spending that much time with Leonardo outside of the office, that was another story. The flight was smooth, but Juliette quickly noticed he was even quieter than usual. He kept his eyes glued to his tablet, flipping through reports, ignoring every attempt she made at small talk. By the time they arrived at the hotel, she was exhausted. From travel, from the silence, from him, the place was stunning. Polished marble floors, glittering chandeliers, the kind of effortless opulence that suited Leonardo perfectly. Juliette was just about to escape to her room when his voice cut through the air. "Dinner at 8, don't be late." She turned, raising an eyebrow. "What?" "Dinner, tonight, with investors. Wear something appropriate." Her lips parted in disbelief. "Something appropriate? Are you implying I don't know how to dress?" Leonardo gave her a flat, unimpressed look. "I'm saying you need to present a professional image." She crossed her arms. "Oh, thanks for the advice, fashion guru." He sighed, already done with this conversation, and walked toward the elevator. Juliette shook her head, muttering under her breath as she headed to her room. The dinner. The restaurant was grand, dimly lit with gold accents, filled with the kind of people who spoke in calculated tones and made million-dollar decisions between sips of wine. Leonardo, in that setting, was in his element. But Juliette saw it now. The way his politeness was perfectly measured. The way his posture was impeccable but rigid. The way his easy smiles never quite reached his eyes. He was playing a role, the untouchable CEO, the steel-forged businessman. And for the first time, Juliette wondered how exhausting it must be to be Leonardo Smith. By the time dinner was over, she was drained. They stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut behind them. Juliette let out a long, dramatic sigh. "I never thought I'd say this, but I actually missed the grumpy Leonardo from the office. This social version of you is terrifying." He glanced at her unimpressed. "And I never thought I'd say this, but you talk too much." She rolled her eyes, but before she could respond, the elevator suddenly jolted and came to a stop. Juliette's breath hitched as she turned to Leonardo, waiting for him to say this was normal, but he didn't. Instead, he pressed a few buttons on the panel. Nothing happened. "Looks like we're stuck." A wave of panic crawled up her spine. No, 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 no. She had never liked small, enclosed spaces, and getting trapped in an elevator with Leonardo Smith of all people, absolutely not on her agenda. "Relax," he said, as if that was the easiest thing in the world. She spun toward him. "Relax? We're stuck inside a metal box, suspended in mid-air, Leonardo. How exactly do you expect me to relax?" He gave her a slow, unimpressed. "Have you ever been stuck in an elevator before? No? Then maybe this is a great opportunity to expand your life experiences." Juliette let out a sharp breath. "Oh, fantastic! I've always dreamed of a near-death experience with my unbearable boss." Leonardo ignored her and picked up the emergency phone. After a brief, measured conversation, he hung up and sighed. "It's going to take at least an hour to fix." Juliette's eyes went wide. "An hour? I'm going to die in here." "You're not going to die." You don't know that. What if we run out of oxygen? Leonardo pinched the bridge of his nose, as if dealing with an overly dramatic child. Juliette, the elevator isn't airtight. You're not going to suffocate. She crossed her arms, pacing the small space like a restless animal. He watched her for a moment, then sighed. You're claustrophobic. Juliette snapped her head up, glaring. No, I just have a healthy appreciation for wide-open spaces and functioning elevators. Leonardo's lips twitched, almost like he was fighting a smirk. Aha! She stopped pacing just long enough to glare at him again. This is not funny. You're right, it's hilarious. Juliette groaned, leaning against the wall. This was going to be the longest hour of her life. I knew something was bound to go wrong on this trip. I could feel it in my bones. My gut was practically screaming at me. Juliette, don't go. If you do, you'll end up trapped in an elevator with a man whose emotional range rivals that of a door. And yet, here I am. Huh. Leonardo arched an eyebrow. I have the emotional range of a door? Yes, you never express emotions. The only time I saw even the slightest crack in that icy exterior was on the balcony at the gala. And even then you shut down in 2 seconds flat. His eyes narrowed, but before he could fire back, Juliette lost her balance, stumbling forward. Before she could hit the ground, Leonardo's hand shot out, gripping her arm and pulling her close. It happened in an instant. That reflex, but suddenly Juliette found herself pressed against his chest, and just like that, the elevator felt impossibly small. She looked up, locking eyes with him. For the first time, there was no mask of indifference, no wall of arrogance, just him. Her heart pounded in her chest, and in that moment time, stood still. She saw it. The flicker of realization in his gaze, the exact moment he understood what was happening, the exact moment he realized he wanted this, just as much as she did. But before anything could happen, the elevator jolted back to life. Juliette sprang back, her face burning. Leonardo cleared his throat, straightened his suit, and averted his gaze. When the doors finally slid open, they stepped out without a word. But as they walked in opposite directions, something had changed. Something between them had undeniably shifted. As Juliette walked down the hotel hallway in the opposite direction, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. And from the way Leonardo glanced at her just before disappearing into his room, she knew he felt it too. The real question was, what were they supposed to do about it? The next morning, Juliette woke up with one goal in mind: pretend nothing had happened in that elevator. It had been a fleeting moment, a lapse in judgment brought on by exhaustion and close quarters, nothing more. But convincing herself was far easier than ignoring the persistent thoughts of Leonardo, especially since he was acting even more distant than usual. Throughout the conference meetings, he barely looked her way, keeping his interactions strictly professional, as if erasing that moment would undo whatever had shifted between them. But his deliberate avoidance only made things more tense. By the end of the day, after hours of formal discussions and relentless networking, Juliette was drained. So when the team received an invitation to a corporate dinner with high-profile investors, she had no interest in attending. All she wanted was to retreat to her hotel room with a good book and escape the mess of complicated emotions swirling inside her. But of course, Leonardo had other plans. It's not optional, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. You need to be there. And that was how Juliette found herself seated at an opulent dinner table, trapped in endless conversations about mergers and investments, while doing her best to ignore the man sitting far too close beside her. She exhaled slowly, taking a deliberate sip of wine. After all, how bad could it be? Very bad, apparently. The problem started with Thomas Bradford, one of the investors. At first, his attention seemed harmless, just casual conversation. But as the evening wore on, his interest in Juliette became far too apparent. He leaned in closer than necessary, his tone laced with something she didn't like one bit. "You're different from the other interpreters I've met," he remarked, his smile a little too self-assured. Juliette returned a polite but distant smile. "Oh, that's interesting. I mean it. There's something captivating about you. I imagine you must be quite popular with men." Before she could formulate a response, the chair beside her shifted. In a heartbeat, Leonardo spoke. "She's with someone?" His voice was cold, measured, sharp as glass. Juliette froze. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Tomas arched a skeptical brow. With someone? Leonardo took an unhurried sip of his wine, his posture as relaxed as ever, but there was an unmistakable edge in his gaze. Yes, he said with quiet finality. Juliette blinked, momentarily stunned. I am? Leonardo shot her a quick glance. Silent, yet unmistakable, a warning not to contradict him. Thomas chuckled, his eyes gleaming with amusement. Funny, she didn't seem to know that. She does now, Leonardo replied coolly. A brief but heavy silence settled over the table. Thomas, however, wasn't so easily deterred. He leaned in slightly, his gaze still fixed on Juliette. Well, if you ever change your mind, he mused, I'd love to take you to dinner. It happened in an instant. Leonardo set his wineglass down, not harshly, but with a deliberate thud. The sound was soft, yet the intent behind it was anything but. She won't change your mind. His voice was quiet, final. Thomas raised his hands in mock surrender. Relax, just a joke. But there was nothing relaxed about Leonardo. Juliette sat there, torn between irritation and something far more unsettling. Did she want to strangle him for acting that way, or was she flattered? By the time dinner finally ended, Leonardo rose from the table without waiting for anyone, his stride purposeful. Juliette had no choice but to follow. The moment they stepped outside into the cool night air, surrounded by the quiet elegance of the hotel garden, she could no longer hold it in. What the hell was that? He stopped, turning to face her. That was me handling a situation before it escalated. A situation? She let out a sharp breath. What do you think I am? Some classified document in need of extra security? He sighed, dragging a hand through his hair. He was out of line. And your brilliant solution was to play the caveman and act like I belonged to you? It worked, didn't it? Juliette's eyes widened in disbelief. Are you serious right now? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, really looked at her, his dark gaze unreadable. I didn't like the way he was looking at you. His voice was quieter this time. Her pulse stuttered. That doesn't give you the right to act like you have some sort of claim over me. He took a slow, measured breath, as if choosing his words carefully. You don't get it, do you? Her brow furrowed. Get what? His expression shifted, frustration flickering beneath the surface, laced with something else, something raw. You throw me off balance, Juliette, he said finally, his voice lower now, almost reluctant, and I'm not used to that. She froze, caught entirely off guard. What? Before she could fully process his words, he cupped her face and kissed her. It was swift, intense, charged with something Juliette couldn't quite define. By the time he pulled away, her breath was uneven, her eyes wide. I don't... Leonardo exhaled sharply, his expression unreadable. Forget it. She touched her lips, still stunned. What do you mean, forget it? His eyes flickered with something... regret, hesitation. But then he shut them for a brief moment, composing himself. I shouldn't have done that. Juliette folded her arms, her heartbeat still erratic. But you did. A tense silence stretched between them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the garden, bewildered, frustrated, and undeniably shaken. She should have been furious. She should have demanded answers, but all she could think about was how much she wanted him to do it again. And that was a very big problem. That night, sleep evaded her. The kiss played on an endless loop in her mind, refusing to fade. Every time she recalled the heat of Leonardo's lips against hers, frustration knotted in her chest, along with something else she wasn't ready to acknowledge. The kiss itself wasn't the issue. It was what came after. He had told her to forget it, like it was nothing. Like that moment hadn't meant anything to him, and maybe it really hadn't. Annoyed, Juliette groaned and threw the covers off. She was not the kind of woman who lost sleep over a man, especially not Leonardo Carter. He might be an infuriating, powerful CEO, but he didn't own her thoughts. By morning, she was determined to act as though nothing had happened. If Leonardo wanted to pretend, she could pretend even better. She arrived at the conference room, spotting him already at work. His focus was absolute, eyes locked on his laptop screen, fingers gliding over the touchpad as he skimmed through reports. Juliette cleared her throat, waiting for him to acknowledge her. Nothing, not even the slightest glance. Good morning, she said, aiming for casual. Silence. She crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes. "Oh, so now you're acting like I don't exist?" Only then did he finally look up, his expression infuriatingly neutral. "I'm not ignoring you," he replied flatly. "I'm just busy." Juliette let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "Busy? After last night? That's all you have to say to me?" Leonardo exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "What do you want me to say?" She felt heat rush to her face. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe start with, 'Sorry for kissing you,' and then pretending it never happened?" With a sigh, he shut his laptop. "Look, Juliette, that was a mistake." The words hit harder than she expected. Her stomach twisted. "A mistake? I got carried away. It shouldn't have happened." Juliette let out a humorless chuckle. "Wow, and here I thought you didn't have it in you to be a complete jerk." His gaze remained steady, serious. "I'm not trying to be a jerk. I'm being honest." "Oh right, the ruthless CEO, always so brutally honest." She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "You know what's funny, Leonardo? You kissed me, you felt something, but instead of handling it like an adult, you're running away like a coward." For a brief second, something flickered in his eyes. Something she couldn't quite place, but then, just as quickly, it was gone. Juliette crossed her arms. "You can act indifferent all you want, but I know that meant something to you." Leonardo pressed his lips into a thin line, then stood, adjusting his suit with practiced precision. "If you're done with your speech, we have a meeting to get to." Juliette stared at him, momentarily speechless. "You're seriously going to do this? Pretend nothing happened and just move on?" Without looking at her, he calmly gathered the papers on the table, aligning them with infuriating patience. "Yes," she huffed, spinning on her heel and marching out of the room without looking back. The rest of the day was a silent war. Every time they crossed paths in the hallway, Leonardo refused to meet her gaze, treating her as if she were just another employee, but Juliette saw through the act. He was fighting something, burying it deep, and if he thought he could ignore it forever, he was very, very wrong. By evening, exhaustion and frustration gnawed at her, so when Olivia, a co-worker, invited her to dinner at a trendy new restaurant, she accepted without hesitation. "You've been acting strange lately," Olivia observed, sipping her wine. Juliette twirled the glass between her fingers, forcing a light smile. "Oh, it's nothing. Just work problems?" "Problems named Leonardo Smith?" Juliette nearly choked on her drink. "What?" Olivia laughed, eyes gleaming with amusement. "Juliette, the whole company can see there's something going on between you two. The way he looks at you." "He doesn't look at me at all. And that's exactly why it's obvious. He never looks at anyone, but he used to look at you. Now he's trying to cover it up." Juliette shook her head, scoffing. "This is ridiculous. There's nothing going on between us." Olivia raised a skeptical eyebrow. "If you say so." Before Juliette could fire back a response, her name was spoken from behind her. She turned, and her heart nearly jumped out of her chest. Leonardo stood there, dressed in his usual sharp suit, his expression as serious and unreadable as ever. "Can we talk?" he asked, completely ignoring Olivia. Juliette blinked. "Now?" "Now," Olivia smirked, raising her hands in surrender. "I'll get another glass of wine. Have fun." Juliette let out a sigh and got up, following Leonardo as he led her to a quieter corner of the restaurant. She crossed her arms. "All right, what do you want?" For a moment, he hesitated, as if searching for the right words. Then he finally spoke. "You were right." Juliette frowned. "About what?" He exhaled slowly, as if the admission itself was foreign to him. "The kiss. How I feel." Her heart pounded. "You feel?" He nodded. "But I don't know how to deal with it." Juliette searched his face, looking for any trace of doubt, but there was none. "Then stop running away." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then, suddenly, Leonardo closed the distance and kissed her again. But this time there was no hesitation, no restraint. It was deep, intense, filled with every emotion he had buried for so long, as if he was finally allowing himself to feel. When they pulled apart, Juliette smiled, breathless. "Now that makes more sense." Leonardo let out a rare chuckle, resting his forehead against hers. "I'm terrible at admitting feelings," she laughed softly. "And I'm terrible at accepting apologies." He brushed his fingers along her cheek, gaze softening. "Can we try again?" Juliette's smile widened. "We can, And this time, there were no more excuses. But something shifted after that night. Leonardo became more withdrawn. He buried himself in meetings, avoided lingering conversations, and whenever Juliette tried to get close, he always found an excuse to leave. It was as if he had taken one step forward, only to retreat 10 steps back. But Juliette wasn't the kind of person to give up easily. One evening, noticing the light in his office still on, she made a decision. Without knocking, she stepped inside. "I know you want to be alone," she said, closing the door behind her. Leonardo looked up from his desk, exhaustion evident in his eyes. "Juliette, just listen." She took a step closer, refusing to let him push her away. "I don't know what you've been through, but avoiding me won't change what you feel." Leonardo closed his eyes for a brief moment before speaking. "Emily was the only woman I ever loved." Juliette felt a sharp sting in her chest, but she held her ground. "And does that mean you'll never love again?" He hesitated. I don't know." Juliette exhaled softly, then reached for his hands, lacing her fingers with his. "You have to let yourself feel again, Leonardo." He studied her, his dark eyes filled with uncertainty, before finally admitting, "I'm scared, Juliette." She gave his hands a gentle squeeze, a small smile playing on her lips. "So am I." Juliette woke up the next morning feeling restless. She and Leonardo had finally broken through the invisible wall between them, but now came the hardest part. Moving forward. Would he let himself step into the future, or would he remain chained to the past? As she sipped her coffee, her mind replayed the night before, the warmth of his hands in hers, the hesitation in his voice, the fear in his eyes when he confessed his doubt. He was broken, and she wanted to help him rebuild, but the real question was, would he let her? When she arrived at the office, she immediately noticed Leonardo's demeanor. It was cold again, and that wasn't a good sign. "Good morning," she said cautiously, testing the waters. "Good morning," he replied, his tone distant, emotionless. She frowned. "Can we talk later?" He didn't even glance at her. "I'm busy today." Juliette inhaled deeply, trying to push down the frustration rising inside her. "I understand." She walked away, but every step felt heavier. He was pulling back, retreating into his walls again, and it was driving her crazy. Throughout the day, she tried to engage, but Leonardo kept things strictly professional. No stolen glances, no lingering pauses, no trace of the man who had held her hands the night before. The cold CEO was back. By the time the office emptied out for the night, Juliette had had enough. She needed answers. She made her way to his office, closing the door behind her. "You're avoiding me," she said, arms crossed. Leonardo let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Juliette, I don't—" "Yes, you are," she interrupted. "Last night you finally opened up to me, and now you're shutting me out again." He stayed silent. "What happened?" He hesitated, as if weighing whether to tell her the truth. Then, finally, "I don't know if I can do this." Juliette's heart clenched, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Why?" He stood up, pacing the room, his hands shoved in his pockets. "I have feelings for you, Juliette. Feelings I haven't had in a long time." Her heart pounded at his words. "Then what's the problem?" He stopped, turning to face her. "What if I can't give you what you deserve?" Juliette took a steady breath, willing herself to be patient. "You think I don't know what I'm getting into?" "I know you have scars, Leonardo, but that doesn't mean you can't love again." He looked away, his jaw tight. "I don't want to hurt you." She stepped closer, reaching up to cup his face, forcing him to look at her. "Then stop hurting me now." For a moment, he just stared at her, conflict swirling in his dark eyes. Then, Juliette's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and her stomach dropped. It was an email from the company, an official statement. "Miss Juliette Cole has resigned from the company, approved by CEO Leonardo Smith." Juliette's breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around her phone as the words blurred before her eyes. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Leonardo tensed. "Juliette?" She took a step back, gripping her phone like a lifeline. "You signed my resignation?" He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. "I thought, after everything that happened, you wouldn't want to stay." A hollow laugh escaped her lips, sharp, bitter. "You decided that for me?" She shook her head in disbelief, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "You're always trying to protect me, aren't you?" she said, her words laced with frustration. Always making decisions in my place. Always running. Her grip on the phone tightened as anger and heartbreak warred inside her. But do you know what hurts the most, Leonardo? Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. I would have chosen you. She turned to leave, but he caught her wrist. Juliette, please. She met his gaze, and for the first time he saw just how much he had broken her. It's over, Leonardo. And with that she walked away, leaving him standing there, alone. Juliette didn't return to the company the next day, or the day after that. She had made her decision. She was done chasing after a man who kept shutting the door in her face. Now, seated at the airport, fingers curled around the edge of her ticket, she felt an odd mixture of relief and sorrow. This was a fresh start, a chance to move forward. But just as she was about to board, a sudden commotion rippled through the crowd, people whispering, pointing. She looked up, and her heart stopped. Leonardo Smith was there, standing in the middle of the airport like a man with nothing left to lose. His gaze locked onto hers before he broke into a run, pushing past stunned onlookers, desperate to reach her. Juliette! She closed her eyes for a fleeting second, steadying herself, before turning to face him. What are you doing here? Leonardo was breathing heavily, his usual composure completely shattered. I was a fool, he said, his voice raw. Juliette folded her arms. I won't argue with that. A wry, breathless laugh escaped him. You never make things easy for me, do you? And you never stop running, she shot back. Silence stretched between them, thick with everything left unsaid. And then, finally, he spoke. I don't want to run anymore. Juliette's heartbeat thundered in her chest. What changed? She asked, her voice softer now, hesitant. He met her gaze, unwavering. I realized I can't live without you. Her breath caught. Leonardo, I love you, Juliette. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. And what if I don't believe you, she whispered. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and right there, in the middle of the bustling airport, dropped to one knee. Juliette's breath faltered. What are you doing? She stammered. Asking you for a chance. Tears slipped down her cheeks, unbidden. This isn't fair, she choked out. For the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. I'm betting everything. She held his gaze for what felt like an eternity before finally exhaling, a mix of exasperation and surrender lacing her voice. I hate you for doing this in front of everyone. Leonardo's lips curled into a knowing smile. But does that mean you'll stay? She hesitated, biting her lip before finally giving a small nod. Yes. The moment the word left her lips, Leonardo shot to his feet, wasting no time in pulling her into a deep, desperate kiss. Around them, the airport erupted into applause, strangers cheering, cameras flashing, voices calling out in excitement. And for the first time in his life, Leonardo knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to run anymore. Juliette never imagined her life turning into a scene straight out of a romantic movie. The coldest, most unreachable CEO in the city had just kneeled in the middle of a crowded airport, baring his heart for her in front of dozens of onlookers, all eagerly recording every second on their phones. And the worst part? She could feel herself melting, unable to fight it. Leonardo clung to her hand, his grip firm as if terrified she might disappear if he let go. His gaze, intense and unshakable, burned into hers. I know I've been an idiot, Juliette, he said, his voice raw. I know I've screwed up more times than I can count. But if there's one thing I've realized in the past few days, it's that nothing matters more than you and me. She swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. Leonardo, Before she could finish, he took her other hand, squeezing both gently, grounding her. Let me prove to you that I can be better, he pleaded, that I won't run anymore. Just give me a chance to make this right. Juliette's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't a calculated move, no arrogance, no carefully constructed walls, just a man, stripped of all pretense, asking her to believe in him. She took a deep breath, narrowing her eyes. If you're lying, I'm not, he cut in, his voice steady, resolute. She studied him for a long moment, searching for any hint of hesitation. Then, finally, she nodded. Okay. A slow, relieved laugh escaped him before he pulled her into another kiss, this time filled with unspoken promises. The crowd went wild, cheers, whistles, even a few dramatic sighs of admiration, Someone shouted, "Now that's how you win a woman back," while another yelled, "CEO of the Year, Juliette," laughed against his lips. "You do realize we're probably going viral right now, right?" Leonardo shrugged, completely unfazed. "As long as you're staying with me, I don't care." That night, he never let her out of his sight. They went to his apartment, and for the first time, Juliette stepped into Leonardo's carefully curated world. Everything was pristine. Crisp white walls, modern furniture positioned with precision, not a single item out of place. She raised an eyebrow as she took it all in. "Your apartment looks like it belongs in an architecture magazine," she teased. Leonardo smirked, leaning against the doorway. "That's only because I've never had anyone around to mess it up." Juliette crossed her arms, feigning offense. "Are you calling me messy?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm saying maybe a little chaos in my life wouldn't be the worst thing." She smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. Before she could respond, he closed the distance between them, slipping an arm around her waist and pulling her flush against him. His voice was low, filled with a quiet intensity. "You know this doesn't end here, right?" She tilted her head, her pulse quickening. "And what exactly are you trying to say, Mr. CEO?" He cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek with breathtaking gentleness. "I'm saying that no matter what happens, I want you in my life." Juliette felt her walls crumbling. "So, you're really ready for this?" she whispered. "For something real?" Leonardo didn't hesitate. "Yes," she smiled. "Okay." And this time, there were no doubts. No running, no turning back. The days that followed were unlike any before. For the first time, Leonardo and Juliette were together. Without walls, without excuses, without fear. He made it a point to have lunch with her every day, to show up at her office with coffee in hand before meetings, to steal a kiss when he thought no one was watching, though at this point the entire company was well aware. And Juliette? She was happy. Truly happy. But then, something changed. It started subtly. Waves of exhaustion that left her drained, dizzy spells that came out of nowhere, and an odd craving for foods she normally wouldn't even consider. At first, she brushed it off. Stress, maybe, a lack of sleep, but when she spent an entire morning hunched over in the bathroom, nausea gripping her like a vice, the realization hit her like a freight train. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at her reflection in the mirror, her skin pale, her hands trembling. This can't be. Fumbling for her phone, she scheduled an appointment immediately. The following day, Juliette sat in the doctor's office, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air as she tapped her fingers restlessly against her knee. She had barely slept the night before, her mind looping through endless possibilities. The door swung open, and the doctor entered with a warm, reassuring smile. "Good morning, Miss Cole. How are you feeling?" Juliette swallowed hard. "Apparently nauseous," the doctor chuckled. "Well, let's see if we can figure out why." Minutes later, the answer came. "Congratulations, you're pregnant." Juliette felt the ground slip from beneath her. Her ears buzzed as the words echoed in her mind. "Pregnant?" The doctor's voice was gentle. "Based on the tests, you're about 6 weeks along." She pressed a hand over her mouth, trying to steady her breathing. She was carrying Leonardo's child. A whirlwind of emotions crashed over her. Joy, fear, disbelief. How would he react? Would he be ready for this? Was she? She glanced down at the test results in her hands, her fingers tightening around the paper. There was no delaying this conversation any longer. That evening, Juliette found herself standing outside Leonardo's apartment, nerves coiling in her stomach. The door swung open, and there he was, a teasing smile already playing at his lips. "You took a while. I was about to come find you." She forced a small smile, her heart thudding wildly. "I needed to think." His expression shifted instantly, concern flickering in his dark eyes. "What is it? Did something happen?" She took a shaky breath. "Yes." Leonardo reached for her hands, his grip firm, grounding. "Juliette, you're scaring me." She bit her lip, searching for the right words, but in the end there was only one way to say it. "I'm pregnant." Silence. The air between them seemed to still, time stretching unbearably long. Leonardo didn't move, didn't even blink. His lips parted slightly, his breath caught. "What?" Juliette felt a lump form in her throat. "I know it's a shock. I I was surprised too, but it's real. For a moment he just stood there, his mind clearly racing. Then suddenly he let out a stunned laugh. Pregnant? She searched his face, her pulse hammering. Was that disbelief or something else? Are you okay? She whispered. Before she could say another word, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him. Burying his face in her hair, he exhaled shakily. I never imagined this. His voice was low, thick with emotion. Then he pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. But it's the best news I've ever gotten. Juliette felt tears welling up, her breath hitching in her throat. So, you're not scared? Leonardo pulled back slightly, cradling her face between his hands, his thumbs gently brushing against her cheeks. Scared? Yes, he admitted, his voice low and sincere. But more than that, I'm happy, really happy. A wave of relief washed over her, and she let out a soft, breathless laugh. Me too, he held her gaze, his expression unwavering. Then marry me. Juliette blinked. Had she heard that right? What? Leonardo's lips curved into a knowing smile. Marry me, he repeated, his voice steady, filled with certainty. Not just because of the baby, but because I want you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Tears slipped down her cheeks, her heart aching with emotion. Are you serious? She whispered. His grip on her hands tightened. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. A shaky laugh bubbled past her lips, overwhelmed by the moment. Leonardo, he pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I'll prove to you that I'm ready for this. For us. Juliette searched his face, feeling her last bit of hesitation begin to fade. Then prove it, she challenged softly. His smile deepened, his confidence unwavering. I will. And in that moment she knew her life would never be the same. Juliette had never been the type to fall for pretty words. She had heard promises before, sweet poetic declarations spoken in the heat of passion, only to dissolve into empty echoes by morning. She had learned the hard way that love was not about what people said but what they did. And now, here she was, standing before Leonardo, the man who had just proposed to her. Her heart screamed yes. It wanted to leap into his arms, to surrender completely. But her mind was stubborn. Leonardo, she murmured, feeling the weight of the moment press against her chest. He held her hand firmly, his piercing blue eyes never wavering from hers. I know what you're thinking, he said, his voice calm yet unwavering. You want to be sure. You need to see that I've really changed. Juliette swallowed hard, nodding slightly. I need to know this isn't just the heat of the moment. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Then, I'll prove it. And he did. The next morning, Juliette awoke to the soft glow of sunlight filtering through her window, and the faint buzz of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. A message from Leonardo. I'll pick you up at 9, no questions. She frowned slightly, but knowing him and his penchant for surprises, she decided to just go with it. By the time she stepped outside, Leonardo was already there, leaning casually against a sleek black car, arms crossed over his chest, a playful smirk tugging at his lips. You're being mysterious, she said as she slid into the passenger seat. He chuckled. I prefer strategic. The car weaved through the city, finally pulling up in front of a building Juliette had never seen before. Her eyes flicked up to the golden sign gleaming above the glass doors. Bright Futures Community Center. She turned to him, curiosity knitting her brows together. What are we doing here? Leonardo stepped out and opened the door for her. You'll see. Inside, the center buzzed with energy. Children darted through the hallways, their laughter ringing in the air. Volunteers sorted through donation boxes, while teachers guided groups of eager students through their lessons. Juliette watched in quiet awe as life unfolded around her. Leonardo's voice was softer when he spoke next. I used to come here when I was younger, he admitted, his gaze sweeping over the familiar space. After my mom passed, my dad buried himself in work, and for a while, this was the only place where I felt like I belonged. Juliette's breath caught. She turned to look at him, her heart squeezing. You never told me that. Leonardo gave a small, lopsided smile. I never told anyone. They walked through the hallway and into a classroom, where a group of teenagers sat huddled around a chalkboard covered in complex calculations. An elderly woman stood at the front, her expression kind but slightly weary as she attempted to explain the material. The moment she spotted Leonardo, her face lit up. "Leonardo, I thought you weren't coming this week," he smiled, stepping forward. Some unexpected things came up. Then, turning to Juliette, he gestured toward the woman. "This is Mrs. Bennett. She was my teacher here when I was 12. Juliette's eyes widened. "You studied here?" Leonardo glanced around the room, nostalgia flickering in his gaze. "I told you I spent time here," he said lightly before looking back at Mrs. Bennett. "Need some help?" She let out an exasperated sigh, shaking her head at the students. "If you can convince these stubborn kids that math isn't their mortal enemy, I'll take all the help I can get." Leonardo chuckled, rolling up his sleeves as he sat among the teenagers. Picking up a marker, he effortlessly began breaking down the equations, explaining them in a way that made the numbers seem almost easy. Juliette stood by the door, watching in quiet amazement. She had seen Leonardo in many different forms: the ruthless CEO, the charming playboy, the stubborn man who refused to take no for an answer. But this version of him, the one who laughed with kids, who softened at the memory of a place that once gave him solace, this was new, and she loved every second of it. Hours later, as they drove home in the quiet hum of the night, Juliette finally spoke. "Do you do this every week?" Leonardo kept his eyes on the road and nodded. "Whenever I can." She studied him, touched by the simplicity of his answer. "I never imagined you were this kind of man," she admitted softly. He glanced at her, a teasing glint in his eyes. "And what kind of man is that?" She smiled. "The kind who cares about others." Leonardo let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "I always have," he murmured. "You just didn't see it." Juliette bit her lip, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't quite explain. "And was this part of your test?" At a red light, he turned fully toward her, his gaze steady, unguarded. "I don't want you to see just pieces of me, Juliette," he said, his voice low. "Not just the CEO. Not just the man who kisses you when he thinks no one is watching. I want you to see me, all of me." Something inside her shifted. She met his gaze, the weight of his words settling deep into her bones. And with the smallest, most honest whisper, she said, "I see you." Days passed and Leonardo never stopped proving himself. He rearranged his schedule just to be with her. He brought her coffee at work, remembering exactly how she liked it. He insisted on picking her up, even when it would have been easier to send a driver. Every single day he checked in on her, asking how she was feeling, making sure she ate, letting her know in every possible way that he was there. But most importantly, he never ran. Not once. And that's when Juliette realized she already had her answer. One evening, as they sat in his apartment over dinner, Juliette set down her utensils and took a slow, steady breath. "Leonardo?" He looked up instantly. "Yes?" Her fingers curled against her lap, nerves prickling her skin. "I want to say yes." Leonardo frowned slightly. "Yes, to what?" She smiled, heart pounding. "Yes, to you." For a brief moment he was completely still, his eyes searching hers, as if making sure he had heard her right. Then, without hesitation, he pushed back his chair, crossed the space between them, and pulled her into a deep, consuming kiss. Juliette smiled against his lips. "Does that mean you liked my answer?" He let out a soft chuckle, resting his forehead against hers. "I've never liked anything more in my life." She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. "Then, I guess we're officially in this together?" Leonardo cupped her face, his touch impossibly gentle. "We always have been." And in that moment, all the doubt faded. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The past few months had been an absolute whirlwind for Juliette. If someone had told her that her entire life would change because of one accidental misstep, walking into the men's restroom at the office, she would have laughed and called them crazy. And yet, here she was, lying on an exam table, cold gel on her belly. She clutched Leonardo's hand as they both stared intently at the ultrasound screen. "And here is your baby," the doctor said, pointing at the monitor. Leonardo's grip on her hand tightened slightly. His usual composed, unshakable demeanor softened, his expression filled with something almost reverent. "That little dot right there? That's our baby?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Juliette nodded, her throat tightening with overwhelming feeling. "Yes, Leonardo, that's our baby." He let out a quiet, breathless laugh, running a hand through his hair as if trying to process the enormity of it. "Wow." The doctor smiled. "Everything looks good. The baby is developing well." Juliette turned her head to look at Leonardo and saw that he was completely mesmerized by the screen. as if nothing else in the world existed in that moment. "Are you okay?" she asked, amusement lacing her voice. He blinked, as if just realizing she had spoken. "Yeah, I'm a CEO. I spend my days making high-stakes decisions, closing million-dollar deals, managing an empire. And now, all of that feels so insignificant compared to this." Juliette's heart swelled. "I know," she whispered. The doctor wiped the gel from her stomach and handed them a few printed ultrasound images. "I'll leave you two to enjoy this moment. See you at the next appointment." Still holding hands, Juliette and Leonardo walked out of the office in comfortable silence, the weight of reality settling over them. In the car, Leonardo held the ultrasound picture between his fingers, studying it as if trying to memorize every detail of their tiny baby. "This is real," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to be parents." She looked at him, the strong, unshakable businessman, now utterly vulnerable over something so small, yet so grand. "Yes, Leonardo," she said softly, "we're going to be parents." He placed a warm hand over her belly, his lips curving into a smile. "I never imagined anything could make me this happy." The next few months flew by. Leonardo was with her at every appointment, holding her hand, hanging on to every word from the doctor. He celebrated each milestone like it was the greatest achievement of his life, his excitement palpable every time he heard the baby's heartbeat or noticed Juliette's belly grow. One evening, as he lounged on the couch reading a parenting book, his free hand absent-mindedly rubbing her belly, he looked up at her with a grin. "Do you realize that I'm officially obsessed with this baby?" Juliette chuckled. "Oh, I realized a long time ago." He closed the book and leaned his head back, looking at her thoughtfully. "Have you thought of any names?" She tilted her head. "Not yet. What about you?" A smirk played at his lips. "I have a few ideas, but I think we should wait until we see her little face before deciding." Juliette raised an eyebrow. "Huh?" He shrugged casually. "I have a feeling it's going to be a girl." She laughed, shaking her head. "Well, if it is, are you ready to be the father of a mini version of me?" Leonardo's eyes widened in mock horror. "God help us," he said dramatically. Juliette gasped and playfully smacked his arm. He chuckled, then pulled her into a kiss, his lips lingering against hers. "Boy or girl?" he murmured. "I already love this little one more than I ever thought possible." Juliette sighed, resting her forehead against his. "Me too." The wedding happened before the baby was born, an event filled with love, emotion, and, as expected, a little chaos. On the morning of the ceremony, Juliette was in her hotel room adjusting the final touches on her wedding dress when the door burst open and her best friend, Clara, rushed in. "We have a small problem," Clara announced, slightly out of breath. Juliette's heart skipped a beat. She turned sharply. "What? Did Leonardo run away?" Clara rolled her eyes. "Of course not, but he is freaking out." Juliette frowned. "Freaking out how?" Clara crossed her arms. "Like a control freak CEO who can't handle not being in charge. He's been checking the wedding schedule every 5 minutes, making sure every tiny detail is perfect, and, in the process, driving the event staff to the brink of a collective breakdown." Juliette stifled a laugh. "He just wants everything to be perfect." "Yes," Clara deadpanned. "And if he keeps this up, your groom is going to pass out before you even get to walk down the aisle." Juliette took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of her gown before turning to her best friend with a knowing smile. "I'll handle it." And with that, she made her way to find the man who, despite being a powerhouse in the corporate world, was absolutely terrified of one simple, uncontrollable truth. Today, she was becoming his wife. 5 minutes later, Juliette found Leonardo in the hotel garden where the ceremony was set to take place. He was pacing back and forth, speaking with one of the planners, his posture tense. "Leonardo." He turned swiftly, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of her standing there in her wedding dress. "Juliette, you're not supposed to see me before the ceremony." She crossed her arms, arching an amused brow. "My love, if I hadn't come out here, you'd have a full-blown nervous breakdown before even making it to the altar." He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "I just want everything to be perfect." Juliette stepped forward, taking his hand in hers and guiding it to her belly. "It already is, Leonardo." His tense shoulders eased as he exhaled, his gaze softening as it met hers. "I love you," he murmured. "And I love you," she whispered back. "Now relax, or I will drag you to that altar myself." A slow grin spread across his lips. "I'd actually like to see that." The ceremony was nothing short of breathtaking. Juliette walked down the aisle, her fingers wrapped around a bouquet of lilies, her heart racing as she met Leonardo's gaze. He stood at the altar, waiting, watching her with a smile so full of love it could melt the coldest of hearts. There, vows were spoken through tear-filled eyes, each word carrying a weight only they could truly understand. And when the officiant finally announced, "You may kiss the bride," Leonardo wasted no time. He pulled her in, capturing her lips in a kiss so deep, so unrestrained, that their guests couldn't help but laugh and applaud. A few months later, they were in the hospital. "You can do this, my love," Leonardo whispered, gripping Juliette's hand as another contraction racked through her. Juliette let out a sharp breath before glaring at him. "I am never letting you touch me again," she screamed, crushing his fingers in her grip. Leonardo laughed. Despite his numb hand, "That's fair, I accept my punishment. But first, let's bring our daughter into the world." And then, after what felt like an eternity, a sharp, tiny cry echoed through the room. "It's a girl!" the doctor announced. Leonardo turned to Juliette, his vision blurring with unshed tears. "I knew it!" he whispered. Juliette laughed, exhausted but utterly overwhelmed with joy. Moments later, a nurse placed their baby in her arms. The instant Juliette saw her daughter's tiny, delicate face, tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "Hi," she breathed, cradling her close. Leonardo leaned in, pressing a tender kiss to their daughter's forehead before kissing Juliette. "She's perfect," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Juliette nodded, unable to look away from the precious life they had created. Leonardo gently took his daughter's tiny hand in his own, his heart swelling with an emotion deeper than anything he had ever known. "Welcome to the world, my princess," he whispered, and in that moment, with his wife by his side and his daughter in his arms, Leonardo knew one undeniable truth. He would never be happier than he was right now. Have you ever walked into the wrong restroom by mistake? What did you think of Leonardo and Juliette's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate their journey? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And be sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the final screen.